Frankie made friends with everybody. There was no stranger in his life.
He loved being outdoors. You get him anything to do with fishing, and he was so happy.
When we found the vehicle, it appeared abandoned.
The amount of blood that the officer was seeing, that person was likely the victim of a fatal injury.
I realized he was gone. I'd never see him again. It was an emptiness. My heart broke.
You can only push so hard. You can't put him in handcuffs and drag him into the police department.
This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I'm not listening to stuff. It's a lie.
The whole time, she just kind of had this look on her face like she couldn't believe this was happening.
I've been through hell my whole life because of this.
These things that have happened for over 25 years have pushed me to do the right thing. I'm going to turn myself in for a crime I was involved in years ago, and somebody lost their life. It was murder.
On May 7th, 1993, the Reading Police Department received a missing persons report from Danelle Tadich. Danelle indicated that her fiancé, Frank McAllister, had borrowed the car the day before and had not returned.
Donnell woke up on the 7th, realized Frank still hadn't come home. She had called his pager several times. He wasn't calling her back. She said that that was outside of his character, and she was concerned.
I got a call from Danelle telling me that Frank was missing and so was her car. I just go, what? It's not like him to just up and leave. I hung up the phone and me and my husband, Jack, went up there to Reading. I just kept thinking of he's going to be there when we get there. Then when he still wasn't, then I started worrying. Something's wrong with him.
I didn't think of anything at the time. I just figured he was, gone somewhere, But if he was going to go out of town, say to leave Reading to go to L.A. or whatever, he would have told somebody so that they would know.
In a typical missing person case of an adult, such as Frank, he's a 19-year-old adult male. He'd only been gone in less than 24 hours at the time she reported it. 19-year-old guy, sometimes that happens. But Donnell reported that Frank had gotten in a vehicle accident a few months prior, totaled his car, and received a $5,000 insurance settlement from that case. So he had just cashed that insurance check the day that he went missing.
Frank was supposed to return the previous night, had cash on his person, and did not return. So obviously our concern there is, okay, has something happened to him, or has he voluntarily left and not returned?
Frank was born September 20th, 1973 in Linwood, California. He was a good baby. He loved to joke. He'd love to tease you and do whatever he could do to get your attention. Frank would get into his dad's fishing poles, and he always got by me and had that fishing pole in his hands outside. Because he would practice. He would throw the fishing rod like he's catching fish and reel it in. You get him anything to do with fishing, and he was so happy. My husband, Doug, and I separated when Frank was about 8 years old. We'd had a lot of ups and downs, and we just couldn't make it anymore. And Frank went to live with his dad up in Reading. It was hard, but I I didn't want him to stay with me, but I didn't even have a car to get around in. I needed to establish my life. So yes, at the time, I thought he was better off with his dad.
Doug and Frankie were constantly doing stuff together. We live so close to the river, and the weather's so hot here in Redding for about 7 months out of the year that that's what you get to do. You go to the river. This is a good spot. There's a nice deep hole right there. So we just bring food and water and spend the day down here doing things. You just climb up the side and jump off into the water. This is our swimming pool. This is where summer happened for us, for Frankie.
At night, we received a call from employees of the Costco in Redding. They had reported a vehicle in the parking lot. It had been there for 2 nights, and it appeared abandoned.
The driver's side window was down, the vehicle was unlocked, the keys were still in the ignition.
We had one of our service officers respond out there to look at the vehicle. She noticed bloodstains on the outside of the vehicle, and the license plate was able to connect that vehicle as belonging to Donnell Tadich. At the time, I was the lead investigator assigned to the Major Crimes Division, and because of the missing persons case on Frank McAllister, as well as the bloodstains on the outside of the vehicle, I was called out to the scene. Upon arrival, we had turned our attention to a close examination of the vehicle. There was a significant amount of blood down the driver's door, the armrest, and down the inside part of the door. The patterning of the blood was primarily centered around the driver's seat.
A white t-shirt that was on the floorboard behind the driver's side seat. It had a significant amount of blood on it. And then a backpack had some newspaper sticking out of it that had blood on it as well.
Also, there was dirt on the vehicle, on the wheels and the wheel wells. So we had this very strong suspicion that something had happened somewhere else and the vehicle had been transported and left abandoned in the Costco parking lot. If we look back to all the cases we had worked where we saw this amount of blood, it was almost always coincided with a homicide case. So we were very, very concerned that someone had been killed in the driver's seat and then something had happened to them. So we wanted to focus this as if it was a homicide case.
Detectives contacted Donnell. Donnell tells detectives that Frank was working as a cook at a local restaurant. They had also just gotten engaged. They were going to elope in Reno and get married and start a life together. She said that Frank had dabbled in the use of narcotics, specifically methamphetamine. But she was trying to get Frank back on track, get him out of the drug use. Donnell told detectives that Frank realized he only had $5,000, not a lot for them to get going in life. So he told Donnell that he wanted to purchase a large sum of methamphetamine and then sell that methamphetamine for a profit.
Violence and crime surrounds the drug community. Over the years, I was involved in numerous cases where one drug dealer killed another drug dealer.
The dots are starting to be connected, that Frank maybe got hooked up with some wrong people, and if he's naive to kind of that world, to a certain element of criminal in our area, he would have been a huge target.
line is you did not pass the test. Okay. Right? Not even close. But I need you to start being honest with me, and I need you to start doing that right now.
Frank had told Donnell that he was going to buy a large sum of methamphetamine and sell it, make a profit, so the two of them could have a life together.
When I found out what the police said about the amount of blood in the car, I thought, well, Frankie's gone, you know, because it was his car, and he's missing. You know, he didn't have a background of being a drug dealer. He didn't have a background of buying drugs. He was pretty naive.
I realized then that I don't think Frank was coming back, and he was gone. And I'd never see him again. It was an emptiness. My heart broke. If you'd have been living with me the whole time, would he have been still alive to this day? Why was he up here doing the he was doing? It's not him. It wasn't him. He was a good kid.
With suspicions of a drug deal gone wrong, detectives reach out to the friends that Frank's fiancée Donnell says he was heading to see when he borrowed her car. 17-year-old Shauna Culver and her brother, 21-year-old Curtis Culver.
Shauna told detectives that she last saw Frank on the afternoon of May 6th, that Shauna and Curtis were hanging out at their apartment. Brian Hawkins was there. Brian was kind of an off-again, on-again boyfriend with Shauna. Frank came by, and Shauna, Curtis, Frank, and Brian all got in Frank's car and drove around Redding, just kind of hanging out. Shauna told detectives that Frank had gotten a text on his pager, and he made a phone call from a payphone. After he made the call, he got back in the car and he told Shauna, Curtis, and Brian that he needed to meet with somebody and it was urgent, and that he would have to drop them off in town at another location, but he would come back and pick them up after he was done meeting this person. Shauna, Curtis, and Brian hung out there for a while and realized that Frank probably wasn't coming back, and Shauna said that they ended up catching a taxi back to their mom's apartment.
Detectives interview Curtis Culver and Shauna's boyfriend, 19-year-old Brian Hawkins. Their accounts of that day are the same as Shauna's.
During our interviews with Brian, Shauna, and Curtis, we did not notice any physical injuries on their hands, fingers, or anything like that, such as you might suspect if there was any sort of fight involving an edged weapon, a knife, perhaps. We had every intention of going back and re-interviewing Shauna and Curtis and Brian, but all three of them pretty much did not speak with us any further. And at that time, we did not have an injured person or a dead body. Without that physical evidence, we are missing pieces of the puzzle to put it all together.
Since Frank had a plan to make a drug deal, investigators turned their attention to the local drug community.
At that point, the tips coming into the police department pretty much exploded. One of the tips that came across us involved an individual by the name of Brian Bennett.
Brian Bennett was a small-time drug dealer in the Redding area, so they were familiar with this name when it came in.
There were several variations on this tip involving Brian Bennett and his involvement with Frank. The first one is that they got together and Brian shot him in the head and dropped him down by the river. The second indicated that Brian had been seen driving Frank's car with Frank in the passenger seat.
Third tip, they said that Brian had been at his house and that Frank had showed up to try and get him to sell him some methamphetamine. Brian Bennett had left his house and had returned really late at night, like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. He's acting very nervous, and his truck is covered in mud, and there's blood on his truck. It's one thing to get one tip, or maybe even two, but when you get 3 like that, all naming the same guy, and the fact that law enforcement's already familiar with Brian being involved in that drug world, and Frank was looking to make more money off of selling drugs, this is starting to maybe make some sense. So they're thinking at this point that they're definitely on the right track here. Detectives are now armed with these 3 tips on Brian Bennett. They want to talk to him immediately at that point. They track him down, they bring him in for an interview. Brian right away said, "Hey, I have nothing to do with this." In fact, you know, that night when he would have disappeared, or that day, I would have been at home. I was hanging out with a group of friends. I was working on my truck.
We, in fact, examined the bed of his truck, the whole tailgate area and all the cracks. Did not see any debris or blood evidence, anything like that.
Detectives were able to check on his alibi and confirm that the information he had provided detectives about what he was doing that day on the 6th matched up.
So at that point, this went into the file of probable false leads.
As 1993 rolls on, the hunt for Frank continues.
My brothers, Mark and Doug, Frank's dad, scoured the area looking for Frankie for months and months. Then I think hope turned into just wanting to find the body. Now it's like, well, let's find him so we can put him to rest.
A little over 11 months after Frank's disappearance, I was contacted by the sheriff's office, and they indicated they were up in the Shingletown area, which is a good 24 miles east of Redding, up in the pine forest. 2 mushroom hunters stumbled across human remains, specifically bones from a skeleton. And at that point, they had also discovered some ID laying on the ground belonging to Frank McAllister. The remains were found 20 to 30 yards off the road.
We're approximately 7 miles down the dirt road from Highway 44.
When I arrived on scene, we conducted a fairly systematic grid search where we walk as a line, trying to discover any and every piece that we can see.
These are areas that are marked off to indicate certain items. Over in this area where the flag is waving in the tree is what appears to be some type of human or animal bone.
These remains were fairly widely scattered. The skull was there, the jawbone was there, the teeth were there, there were ribs and vertebrae. The lower part of the body all had been scavenged by animals and the bones dispersed.
They found some dark-colored tennis shoes, a dark pair of jeans, and a sock. These were all consistent with the clothes that Frank was reported to have been wearing by Donnell when she made the missing person report 11 months prior.
Dental records confirm that the remains are those of Frank McAllister.
I got a call from the police They said, "We found your son's remains," and I dropped the phone and I just started crying. I mean, I didn't know what to do. And then to find out he was murdered and left where he was left, you know?
We wanted closure, and that was some comfort. We can lay Frankie's remains to rest and have a place to go and talk to him.
It was hard to bury your son so young and not get to really see him grow up and be something. It was really hard.
As 19-year-old Frank is interred, the autopsy report hits detectives' desks.
The forensic anthropologist discovered 2 knife wounds, one on the jawbone and one on one of the upper vertebrae.
It was evident from the markings on the spine that Frank McAllister's throat was likely slit. There were other marks in the spine that showed a knife had gone through and nicked the spine, consistent with having somebody over the top of you, stabbing you through your chest.
So this thing's ramping up now. We just went from having a missing person case to a full-blown homicide investigation. Now we're going to be making another push to get another interview with the Culvers and Brian Hawkins. If you re-interview people, sometimes their stories start changing. They were the last 3 to most likely be seen with Frank before he was killed. At this point, they're really the only solid leads that detectives have.
I don't want to do it. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to talk anymore.
Is there any reason why?
No, I don't want to be doing this anymore. Unless you're going to detain me and arrest me.
Detectives did try and make another run at Shauna and Curtis Culver, Brian Hawkins. But it's only been 11 months. Shauna's still a minor at this point, so we're not going to be able to talk to Shauna at all.
You can only push so hard. You can't put him in handcuffs and drag him into the police department. You have to have a reason to do that. In this case, we were shut down. They cut off all contact with us.
2 years after Frank is murdered, the investigation into the teen who never came home cools like the mist off Lake Shasta, and the case goes cold.
In my heart, he was gone and he was buried. And then one time, I went upstairs to lay down. And he was there when he was 8 years old. His hair, the way I combed it and everything. And he looked at me and he says, "Mom, I'm okay. Don't worry about me no more. I'm okay." And then he went away and I woke up and I said, "He's okay now. He's in heaven. He's okay."
Nearly 25 years after Frank's murder, a young television news reporter is by her phone.
So in January of 2018, I'm 6 months in as a brand new reporter at KRCR. And I get this call from my grandpa. And I say, "Hey, Grandpa, I'm working. What's up?" And he goes, "Well, I have this guy. He's got some information on this murder in Shingletown from 25 years ago. He wants to talk to you." And I'm thinking, I don't have time for this. But I hear him out. A lot of people know my grandpa, Tony Trapasso, here in Redding. My grandma and grandpa go to church every Sunday, but my grandpa Tony, on this Sunday, had a man approach him saying that he had some things that he wanted to talk to him about and pray about, but specifically, he wanted to speak with him about Frank McAllister's death. And the man's name was Brian Hawkins.
Courtney rushes to Jennifer Scarborough, the news director at KRCR, to pitch the breaking story.
My boss said that she remembered this story, and knowing that somehow we might have details that could help this cold case, we both agreed, okay, well, we can't pass up this opportunity to talk to this man because no one has solved this in 25 years. Seeing Brian Hawkins for the first time, he was looking around, fidgety, nervous. He sat down. And I said, so what'd you come here to tell me today?
I'm going to turn myself in next door at the sheriff's department for a crime I was involved in years ago. And somebody lost their life. It was murder.
And right there, I'm like, wait, what?
God and Christ, these things that have happened throughout my whole life since then, for over 25 years, have pushed me to do the right thing.
He said that God had led him to that. He had gotten saved, and that he knew that he needed to make it right. The one thing that he wouldn't give me details of, and what I wanted details about the murder.
Somebody came up with an idea, or whatever you want to call it. They knew him. It wasn't my idea. Almost every minute of every day has been a nightmare.
I've been through hell my whole life because of this.
While I finished the interview with Brian, my boss was calling the police department and telling them, hey, we have these details. He's going to be bringing himself in. And they said, hey, there's 2 other people involved in this case. Can you hold off on airing this interview until we can go get them?
KRCR management agrees to delay airing Hawkins' confession for 24 hours.
I remember my sergeant coming into my office and saying, hey, you need to get over to the sheriff's office because there's a guy in there that's wanting to confess to the Frank McAllister homicide. I'm like, what? One of the things you do as a new detective is familiarize yourself with cold cases. But I hadn't looked at the McAllister case since 2012, so it's like 6 years. In interviews with suspects, you always try and get a rapport going with that person.
We're out of root beer with Sherry Pepsi.
Right on, dude.
Well, you like that?
Yeah.
I introduced myself to him, and I just told him, I looked at this case 6 years ago. I said, I haven't looked at it since. I'm going to give you your time.
So I'd like to hear, at this point, kind of what you have to say.
My girlfriend at the time was Shauna Colbert. She had an idea she wanted to murder Frank because he had money on him and he wanted to buy a quarter-pound of Frank. She gave me a knife. She showed it to me in the bedroom.
Why'd she say she was getting a knife at that time?
That's what she wanted to use to kill him.
Later that day, Frank shows up at the apartment, and Brian told Frank that he could be the middleman for that methamphetamine deal. The 4 of them get in Frank's car together. Frank's driving the car. Brian's seated right behind Frank. Curtis Culver's in the right front passenger seat, and Shauna's sitting right behind her brother. Brian directs Frank to drive to the Shingletown area. They get back to this real remote area, and they sit in the car and talk for a couple of hours, and Brian tells me that Shauna kind of nudges him and pulls out the knife that she had shown him.
What exactly is she saying to you in the backseat?
To stab him.
She's telling you to stab him.
And that's when Brian tells me Curtis pulls his own knife out.
And who stabbed him first? Curtis did, from the front passenger seat. Mm-hmm.
Brian tells me that Frank gets out of the vehicle and falls down on the ground just outside his car.
I went on top of him and I stabbed him also in the neck. I don't know how many times.
What made you get on to what made you decide to do that?
I don't know.
And you stabbed him, you told me, a whole bunch of times.
In the neck, yeah.
In his neck?
Yes.
What made you stop doing what you're doing to him?
Because I was yelling.
You were yelling?
Yeah. Screaming.
What were you screaming?
I don't know.
He's crying. He was visibly shaking uncontrollably at times. You could tell he was seeing it all over again in his head. He said he then got off of him. He recalled Curtis grabbing Frank and dragging him up towards the front of the vehicle.
I hear him say, "Hey, Brian, look." And he dropped a big rock on his head.
Curtis?
Yes.
You just
dropped it on his head.
Brian told me that Shauna and Curtis drug Frank's body up into the trees. They get into the car. Brian says he drives to Costco while Shauna and Curtis are inside making phone calls for a taxi. Brian tells me that he grabs like a newspaper and he's trying to wipe up blood the best that he can. And then Shauna and Curtis came out of Costco. Shauna and Curtis pulled out a big wad of cash.
They gave me some money.
Money from Frank?
Yes. There was blood on it.
Brian told me that Shauna and Curtis gave him a few $100s, and they essentially parted ways.
I've been scared to death ever since.
I would be too.
With Brian Hawkins' televised confession set to air in less than 24 hours, Redding detectives race to find the Culbers.
We're really on the clock at this point, and the stars aligned. Within like a few hours, they had tracked both the brother and sister, Shauna and Curtis Culber, down to a town south of us in Red Bluff. So they headed out that next morning. Curtis agreed to come up for an interview. Shauna dug her heels in and was refusing to come up.
I don't want to do it. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to talk anymore.
Is there any reason why?
No, I don't want to be doing this anymore. Unless you're going to detain me and arrest me.
Hold on.
And I said, well, arrest her and bring her here.
Detectives split up the Culbers to interview them, with Rusty Bishop taking Shauna.
So comfortable.
Shauna waives her rights, and she talks about the case, gives the same story she gave in 1993. And I tell her, well, I go, some things have changed.
Brian came in yesterday, and he told us everything that happened from the get-go. And based on that and everything else that we have, he's been arrested for murder. Obviously, your name came on. Curtis's name came on.
I just don't understand it.
Well, Sean, I think you do. I think you do.
He did not do it.
Why are you saying that?
He didn't do it.
How do you know?
Because I just know he didn't do it.
So she still doesn't really believe Brian confessed, so I end up queuing up the interview on a laptop.
I have an idea you wanted to know.
I had an idea? It's a lie.
And the whole time she just kind of had this look on her face like she couldn't believe this was happening.
She gave me a knife. That's what she wanted to use.
I don't know why he's saying that. This is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I'm not listening to that. It's a lie.
What exactly is she saying to you in the backseat?
To stab him.
That's not true.
Tell me what really happened.
I never did any of that.
You tell me what
Anything.
You saw it.
He says I had a knife.
You saw what happened.
I gave him a knife.
And you tell me what happened.
I never did any of that. I never did that. I never said that. And he's a liar. He's a liar.
The whole time, she's trying to distance herself from him at this point. She realizes this is her worst nightmare.
Why would he even say that?
Things that he told me in that interview can be supported with physical evidence.
Well, then it's supported with physical, obviously, because I need a lawyer.
Why you're here.
I need a lawyer. And that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say anymore. I want a lawyer.
Down the hall, Detective Bishop's partner, Eric Garnero, interviews Shauna's brother, Curtis Culver.
Curtis Culver stuck to the same story that he had been telling for the last 25 years. It was almost a script we knew we would hear.
He got a page, and then he shoot us out of his car.
He didn't even drive you guys back home?
No.
During his interview, my partner convinced Curtis to take a polygraph.
Test is about to begin. Were you physically present when Frank was killed?
No.
That was the greatest thing that ever happened. Curtis bombs it.
The bottom line is you did not pass the test.
Okay.
Right? Not even close. But I need you to start being honest with me. And I need you to start doing that right now.
I think that Curtis realized he just didn't have anywhere to go. This thing is over. He had to tell him what really happened. Curtis said he didn't have the same knowledge about trying to rob or kill Frank prior to them going to Shingletown. He honestly thought it was a drug deal that Brian was setting up for Frank. Curtis had a different spin on the confrontation in the car. He said he got really scared. He couldn't tell my partner why he got scared, but he said he pulled a knife out and he held it, pointing it at Frank. He's just pointing it at him.
And then what happened?
So, Brian does it.
So he grabbed his head.
Yeah, and...
Did he do a slash or was
No.
he stabbing? Oh, really?
Yeah.
He's going right for it, huh?
Yeah.
Frank gets out of the car, falls down. All three of them get out of the car. Brian gets on top of Frank and proceeds to stab him over and over. When Brian is done stabbing Frank, Curtis says he picks up a rock, which he described as about the size of a basketball.
Was he saying anything at this point?
If he was, it was nothing that I could understand.
Was he moving?
Yes.
And how did you use this rock?
I threw it at his head. Mercy.
Mercy.
True mercy.
But that also tells us that Curtis essentially helped with the murder himself. So that's huge.
Reading detectives have all three suspects in the murder of Frank McAllister under arrest, just as KRCR airs Brian Hawkins' admission.
A confession nearly 25 years in the making from Brian Keith Hawkins.
I know the wrong can't be changed, but this is as close as I can come to doing the right thing. It's kind of weird that Frank never even got to have a life, and either did I.
As a teenager, Hawkins says he was blind.
I believe he really did get God to tell him to confess.
That he wasn't remorseful for what he had done.
But why did he wait so long to get this off his chest? Why 25 years?
Talked to him several times.
I'm just sorry I don't have him with me no more. Because of him. But why? Just because your girlfriend told you to do it?
Prosecutors believe they have a solid case against their three suspects, despite contradictory accounts of what happened that day.
The evidence shows that Frank most likely had his throat slit from behind based on the cuts to the vertebrae. It makes more sense too because it's a position of advantage. It's a surprise. Brian's in the perfect spot. It may have been a plan of Shauna's to kill Frank, but we knew of some animosity between Brian and Frank.
It seemed like Brian was accumulating anger. Like he thought that Frankie is trying to put the moves on my sister.
He snapped and took Frank's life because he was angry with him.
In November of 2019, Brian Hawkins came into court and pled guilty to murder and robbery and all the enhancements. He then was ultimately sentenced to 25 to life for first-degree murder of Frank McAllister.
Facing a mountain of evidence, the Culvers strike a plea deal.
On January 14th of 2022, Shauna Culver pled guilty to her responsibility for the murder, to robbery and additional charges, and received 20 years in state prison. Curtis Culver pled guilty to manslaughter and robbery and various other assault charges, and he received 35 years in state prison.
I wanted justice, but truthfully, nothing will bring back your child. I know he went to heaven. He's up there with his dad now. They're probably fishing all the time, and he's in a better place than we are right now. But having to go so long without finding an answer and going through half of my life not knowing what happened. What good is it now? It can't bring him back. We can't bring him back.
It's easy to think about what Frankie lost out on in his life. Dreams and aspirations, and, he was dreaming of having a life, having a girlfriend or a wife, of having a kid of his own and getting to watch him grow up. He missed out on being with his father when his father passed away. He missed out on all that. Frankie could have led a normal, everyday life. The chance is gone. It's just a sad ending to his short life.
The tape begins with a hiss, a breath caught in the throat of the room, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until it feels loud, and then a voice breaks through, steady but sharp, asking a question no one has answered in nearly 3 decades. Where were you on the night she vanished, when the fog rolled in from the Pacific and the streetlights turned the asphalt into a river of dull gold? California, 1995, a year of sun-bleached headlines and quiet neighborhoods that believed they were safe, until one night proved otherwise. The clock on the dash read 10:42 p.m., the kind of detail that survives when everything else dissolves, and somewhere between a closed storefront and a darkened bus stop, a woman disappeared, leaving behind a city that would spend years pretending it had not heard her scream. Her name was whispered first, then printed, then reduced to a grainy photograph taped to utility poles, eyes smiling in a way that made strangers stop and look twice. She was 26, a night shift waitress, the last person seen locking the back door of a diner that smelled of coffee and bleach. The manager said she waved, said see you tomorrow, said nothing unusual, and that phrase, nothing unusual, would haunt the investigation like a bad joke. Because everything about that night was unusual once you looked closer. The register was balanced. Her purse was gone. Her car sat untouched in the employee lot, keys still warm in the ignition, as if she had stepped away for a moment and simply failed to return. Police arrived under a sky so clear it felt indifferent. Flashing lights painted the walls red and blue, neighbors gathered in bathrobes, and the word missing slid into the air with a weight no one wanted to accept. Officers walked the perimeter, noted the scuff marks near the alley, a single shoe lying on its side like it had been dropped mid-stride. It was a black flat size 7, scuffed at the heel, ordinary in every way except for the fact that it did not belong where it was found. The alley led nowhere, a narrow passage between dumpsters and brick, ending at a locked gate, and the first theory took shape quickly, too quickly. the way early theories often do. A robbery gone wrong. A jealous ex. A drifter passing through. The city had heard these stories before and learned how to digest them without choking. Her family learned the news at midnight, a knock at the door that split the house into before and after. They described her room later as untouched, bed neatly made, a jacket hanging on the chair, as if she might come back any minute to complain about her feet and laugh about the customers who stayed too long. They sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the radio murmuring updates that offered nothing, and when the sun rose it revealed a neighborhood that looked exactly the same, which felt like an insult. The search began with flashlights and coffee, volunteers combing fields and creeks, helicopters thudding overhead, reporters circling like birds who had learned the sound of tragedy. The first break came not with a discovery but with a phone call. An anonymous tip, a voice distorted by fear or calculation, claiming to have seen her arguing with a man near the bus stop around 11. Tall, maybe, dark jacket, details that dissolved under scrutiny. Detectives canvassed the area, knocked on doors, wrote names in notebooks that would grow thick and heavy with time. They interviewed coworkers, friends, ex-boyfriends, the kind of interviews that feel invasive even when you know they are necessary. One ex admitted to arguing with her weeks earlier, another had no alibi for that night, and for a moment the case narrowed, sharpened, threatened to become simple. It did not last. Alibis firmed up. Leads went cold. The alley gave up nothing more than the shoe and a cigarette, but crushed into the concrete, brand common enough to belong to half the city. Weeks passed, then months, and the word missing began to feel inadequate. Posters faded. The diner reopened. Customers asked questions in low voices and then stopped asking altogether. Investigators found a scrap of fabric near the gate at the end of the alley, caught on rusted metal, fibers consistent with denim, nothing unique enough to hold onto. They collected it anyway, sealed it in a bag, wrote a date and time in careful ink, unaware that this small, almost forgettable piece would one day pull the past into the present with brutal force. In 1995, DNA was a promise more than a certainty, a tool that worked best when the sample was clean and the suspect already known. The cigarette but yielded nothing usable. The fabric sat in evidence, catalogued and forgotten as resources shifted to fresher cases, louder crimes, bodies that demanded attention because they were found. This case offered no such clarity. No body. No crime scene you could point to and say this is where it happened. Just absence, and absence is notoriously difficult to prosecute. The community adjusted in the way communities do, by compartmentalizing fear. Parents walked their kids to school a little longer than before. Waitresses took rides home. The alley got a new light installed, bright and unforgiving, illuminating the place where nothing had been proven to occur. The family refused to move on. They marked birthdays with candles and hope, holidays with empty chairs. They called detectives monthly, then yearly, then learned the cadence of a cold case, the way silence stretches and explanations thin out. They were told there was nothing new, that the file remained open, that someone was still assigned. They learned to hear the difference between reassurance and routine. Years stacked up like evidence boxes, each one labeled and shelved, and the case slipped into a category that feels like a verdict even when it is not. Cold case. The phrase sounds clinical, but it carries a chill that seeps into bones. It means the initial momentum is gone. It means the people who remember details start to forget. It means the city grows, changes, and the night she vanished becomes a footnote in a decade crowded with other headlines. But cold does not mean dead. It means preserved, waiting. In the early 2000s, a new detective pulled the file, someone young enough to see the case without nostalgia, old enough to understand its weight. He read the reports, looked at the photographs, lingered on the alley and the shoe, the scrap of denim, the unanswered questions scribbled in margins. He drove the route she would have taken home, counted steps, measured distances, imagined fear. He reopened interviews, tracked down witnesses who had moved on with their lives, some reluctant, some eager to finally say something they had buried. One mentioned a van idling near the bus stop that night, white, unmarked, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time. Another recalled hearing a shout, thought it was laughter, changed the channel. The van led nowhere. The shout led nowhere. The file thickened without advancing. Technology improved in increments that felt dramatic on television and incremental in reality. The scrap of denim remained in its bag, fibers intact, DNA present but degraded, a whisper instead of a voice. And then, quietly, almost apologetically, the science caught up. By the mid-2010s, labs could pull profiles from samples that once would have been dismissed. Cold cases across the country stirred, names returned to headlines, families learned new words like genealogy and phenotyping, learned that the past could be interrogated with tools that did not exist when it happened. The call came on a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the way it rearranged time. A lab technician, careful not to promise too much, reported that a partial profile had been extracted from the fabric. Not enough for a direct hit in criminal databases, but enough to suggest a path forward. Investigators submitted the data to a genealogical database with permission protocols that took months to navigate, each step documented, scrutinized, aware of the balance between justice and privacy. The wait resumed, but this time it vibrated with a different energy, like a wire pulled taut. When the first familial match appeared, it was distant, a third cousin twice removed, a name attached to a family tree sprawling across states and decades. Analysts built the branches slowly, cross-referencing ages, locations, criminal histories, the mundane and the sinister overlapping in spreadsheets that turned lives into variables. The tree narrowed. A cluster of men emerged who would have been in the area in 1995, who fit the age range, who owned vehicles matching vague descriptions. One name kept surfacing, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. A man who had lived 3 miles from the diner. A man with a record for assault that never escalated to prison. A man who had moved away quietly in the late 90s, leaving behind a job and few friends. Detectives did not rush. They rebuilt the case as if it were new, revisited the alley, re-interviewed witnesses with fresh questions, obtained discarded DNA legally, methodically, the way cold cases demand patience and precision. The comparison came back late on a Friday, the kind of timing that feels cinematic until you are in the room and realize it is just another hour ticking by. The profile matched. Not partially. Not tentatively. It matched in a way that snaps spine straight and sends hands to faces. A DNA breakthrough, decades late, arriving without fanfare and changing everything. The suspect was arrested at dawn, surprised in the way people are surprised when they believe the past has forgotten them. The community woke to headlines that felt unreal, the word solved printed next to a year that seemed impossibly far away. Investigators spoke carefully, emphasized process, evidence, the long road to this moment. The family heard the news in a living room that had held grief for years, and the sound they made was not quite relief, not quite joy, something complicated and heavy and human. But even as the cuffs clicked and the cameras rolled, the questions did not evaporate. Where had she been taken? What had happened in those missing hours? Why had it taken so long? Cold cases thaw unevenly, revealing truths and leaving voids, and the night she vanished still clung to the city like fog, reminding everyone that time does not heal all wounds, but sometimes, if you wait long enough and look hard enough, it tells the truth. The interrogation room smells like stale coffee and disinfectant, the kind of place where time slows and words carry weight long after they're spoken, and across the table sits a man who has lived most of his life believing this moment would never arrive. His hands rest flat, fingers spread, a gesture meant to signal cooperation, but his eyes betray something else, a flicker that moves too quickly to name. Outside the room, investigators stand shoulder to shoulder, listening through glass and wires, aware that the DNA breakthrough has opened a door but not yet shown them what lies beyond it. An arrest does not equal answers. It only means the silence has been challenged. He says little at first. He asks for water. He asks why now. He says he doesn't remember 1995 the way they seem to think he should, says it was a lifetime ago, that people change, that memories blur. The detectives let the pauses stretch, let the hum of the lights do its work. They mention the alley without naming it, the diner without describing it, the night without attaching emotion. He shifts when they talk about denim fibers, about the science that reached back through decades and found him anyway. He shakes his head, insists on coincidence, on contamination, on mistakes that happen when technology gets too confident. He does not confess. Not yet. Not ever, if he has anything to say about it. News spreads faster than facts. California 1995 cold case solved becomes a banner across screens and papers, and the word solved lands hard, as if it can close doors that have been open too long. Neighbors remember him suddenly, reconstruct casual interactions into ominous foreshadowing. A woman recalls his van parked awkwardly on her street. A former coworker remembers an offhand comment about night shifts and lonely walks home. Each memory is offered with urgency, with the relief of relevance, and investigators log them carefully, aware that time reshapes recollection into something unreliable but still necessary. The family sits with the headlines and feels the collision of past and present. They have waited years for movement, for proof that the system did not forget, and now movement has arrived with a force that threatens to knock them off balance. Interviews are requested. Statements are drafted. They choose words that honor her without turning her into a symbol, knowing the media will do that anyway. They talk about her laugh, her stubbornness, her plans to save money and travel north, small details that resist the flattening effect of tragedy. At night, when the cameras are gone, they sit with the same questions they have always had, sharpened now by proximity to an answer that still feels incomplete. Prosecutors begin the slow work of turning science into a narrative a jury can understand. DNA explains how a suspect connects to an object, not what happened between two people on a dark street. They build timelines, pull phone records that barely exist, analyze employment logs, reconstruct routes. They search for the missing hours like archaeologists sifting dirt, hoping for a fragment that will make the shape of the story visible. They find receipts that place him nearby earlier that evening. They find a witness who remembers a man matching his description arguing near the bus stop, anger sharp enough to cut through traffic noise. They find a pattern of behavior that suggests escalation, but patterns are not proof. They need something that breathes. The defense moves quickly, framing the case as a cautionary tale about over-reliance on new technology applied to old evidence. They question chain of custody, raise doubts about contamination, emphasize the absence of a body, the absence of a crime scene. They remind anyone listening that absence cuts both ways. Without remains, they argue, there is no certainty of death, no certainty of violence, no certainty that a crime occurred at all. It is a strategy that feels cruel to the family and precise to the law, and it lands with unsettling effectiveness. Cold cases carry inherent vulnerabilities, and everyone in the room knows it. Investigators return to the physical spaces with a renewed urgency, seeing them through the lens of a suspect who can no longer be hypothetical. The alley feels narrower than before, the gate heavier. They trace paths with their eyes, measure distances again, test sight lines, imagine the logistics of control and movement. They find nothing new, and the lack of discovery feels louder than it did years ago. Sometimes the most important evidence is what isn't there, the gap that suggests intention, planning, the removal of traces by someone who understood the risks. The suspect's past becomes a map dotted with warning signs that were never connected. A bar fight that ended with a warning. A restraining order quietly lifted. A neighbor's complaint about shouting that went nowhere. Each incident alone was forgettable, absorbed by a system designed to manage volume, not prophecy. Together, they form a picture that feels obvious in hindsight and invisible in real time. This is how monsters often look when they are not performing monstrosity, how danger hides in plain sight. As the case inches toward trial, the community wrestles with its own complicity. People ask themselves what they ignored, what they assumed, how many nights they walked past that alley without thinking about the shoe that once lay there, ordinary and abandoned. The diner installs a memorial plaque by the back door, a small rectangle of metal that reflects the kitchen lights. Some customers pause to read it. Most do not. Life continues, stubborn and indifferent, even as the past insists on being acknowledged. The science, meanwhile, continues its quiet march. Analysts refine their work, test secondary samples, look for corroboration in places no one thought to search before. A hair caught in a seat seam from an old vehicle impound yields nothing. A stain on a jacket long discarded remains inconclusive. The DNA that sparked the arrest stands alone, powerful and precarious. It is both a triumph and a reminder of how much can hinge on a few cells preserved by chance. In court filings, the phrase cold case appears again and again, stripped of its drama, used as a descriptor, a category. But in the gallery, it carries a different meaning. It represents years of unanswered phone calls, holidays marked by absence, a city that learned to live with a question mark. When motions are argued, when experts testify about probabilities and thresholds, the family listens for something else, something human that will explain why she never came home. The suspect maintains his innocence with a consistency that frustrates and fascinates. He tells anyone who will listen that he is a victim of timing, of a system eager to close a file. He points to the lack of physical remains as proof of uncertainty, speaks calmly, almost kindly, about the family's pain as if it were an abstract concept. In recorded calls from jail, he talks about the weather, about the food, about how strange it feels to be back in California after so long. He does not talk about that night. As the months pass, cracks appear not in the science, but in the expectations built around it. The public learns that solved does not mean finished, that an arrest does not guarantee a conviction, that truth is a process rather than a switch. Some grow impatient. Others grow skeptical. Online forums fill with theories that range from plausible to wild, each post an attempt to impose order on uncertainty. The case becomes content, debated and dissected by people far removed from the alley, the diner, the empty chair at the table. Investigators feel the pressure acutely. They know this may be their last chance to speak for someone who cannot speak for herself. They chase a final lead, a rumor about a remote stretch of land, a place the suspect was known to frequent. Cadaver dogs are brought in. Shovels break soil that has been undisturbed for decades. The search yields rusted cans, animal bones, disappointment. Cameras capture the effort, the solemnity, the quiet acceptance when nothing is found. Absence, again, refuses to give up its secrets. And yet, something has shifted. The cold case is no longer frozen in time. It moves, it resists, it demands engagement. The community feels it in conversations that turn serious without warning, in the way parents still glance over their shoulders when night falls. The family feels it in the strange blend of hope and dread that comes with every update. They are closer than they have ever been to answers, and farther from closure than the headlines suggest. The interrogation room sits empty now, lights off, chairs pushed in, waiting for its next use. The tape that began with a hiss has accumulated hours of sound, questions asked and unanswered, silences that speak volumes. Somewhere between the science that named a suspect and the story that remains incomplete lies the truth of what happened on that foggy night. It is there, suspended, a reminder that even when a cold case is declared solved, the cold can linger, seeping into the cracks, refusing to fully thaw. The courtroom air feels heavier than it should, thick with anticipation and the quiet friction of opposing truths, and as the proceedings begin, the past is dragged forward inch by inch, reluctant but exposed. The judge's voice cuts through the murmur, procedural and calm, a reminder that what follows will be governed by rules that do not bend for grief or outrage. Across the aisle, the family sits close, hands folded, eyes fixed on a space that has waited for this moment longer than anyone cares to admit. They have learned not to expect catharsis. They have learned that justice moves at its own pace, indifferent to anniversaries and sleepless nights. The prosecution opens with restraint, aware that spectacle can backfire when evidence is thin in places that matter. They talk about the night without embellishment, about a woman who locked a door and never made it home, about a city that went to sleep and woke up missing someone it did not yet know how much it would lose. They introduce the DNA carefully, frame it as a thread that ties a suspect to a place and a moment, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to listen closely. Jurors nod, pens moving, faces neutral in the way people learn to be when they know they will be asked to decide something enormous. The defense responds with precision, dismantling assumptions before they harden. They remind the room that cold cases are fragile by nature, that memory decays and evidence degrades, that science evolves and brings with it new uncertainties. They emphasize what is absent, repeat the word no until it becomes a drumbeat. No body. No eyewitness who can swear to seeing violence. No confession. They suggest a narrative of coincidence and overreach, of a system desperate for resolution after years of failure. It is a story that does not require the suspect to be good, only unlucky. Expert witnesses take the stand, translating complex processes into language meant to be understood by people who have never peered into a lab. They explain how a few cells can persist against odds, how probability works, how error rates shrink when protocols are followed. Under cross-examination, they acknowledge limitations, concede that contamination is always a risk, that certainty is a spectrum rather than a point. The room absorbs this quietly, the way it absorbs all things that are difficult and necessary. Science, stripped of its aura, becomes human work, careful and flawed. Outside the courthouse, the media waits, cameras angled for reaction rather than substance. The headline writers sharpen verbs, choose adjectives that imply finality even as the trial proves anything but. California 1995 cold case, solved remains the phrase of choice, repeated until it feels less like a statement and more like a dare. People read it on their phones between errands, discuss it over coffee, argue about guilt and innocence without ever stepping into the alley or the diner. Distance makes certainty easier. Inside, witnesses from the past speak haltingly, voices trembling as they reach for memories that have been boxed away. A coworker describes the wave, the ordinary goodbye that turned extraordinary in hindsight. A neighbor recalls the van, unsure now of color, of timing, of whether it was even that night. Each testimony is a fragment, incomplete and sincere, shaped by the desire to help and the fear of being wrong. The jury listens, weighing not just words but confidence, pauses, the human tendency to fill gaps with meaning. The suspect takes notes throughout, expression controlled, occasionally whispering to his attorney. When he finally speaks, it is to deny, to assert a version of himself that does not intersect with the alley or the shoe or the scrap of denim. He tells a story of routine and forgettable days, of a life that followed predictable lines until it was interrupted by an accusation that reached back through time. He does not raise his voice. He does not cry. His calm unsettles some and reassures others. It is difficult to measure sincerity when the stakes are this high. As days turn into weeks, the trial becomes a study in endurance. The family counts hours, marks progress in the shifting positions of the sun through courthouse windows. They learn the names of jurors by number, invent private rituals to get through testimony that opens old wounds. At night, they dream of answers delivered clearly and wake to the reality of ambiguity. Hope becomes a careful thing, rationed to avoid collapse. The defense introduces alternative explanations, suggesting that the DNA could have arrived on the fabric through secondary transfer, that the alley was a public space, that proximity does not equal culpability. They point to the absence of any violent history escalating to murder, argue that the prosecution's narrative relies too heavily on inference. It is a compelling performance, one that underscores how thin the line can be between suspicion and proof. Closing arguments arrive with a sense of exhaustion rather than climax. The prosecution speaks of responsibility, of trusting the convergence of evidence even when it is incomplete, of honoring a life interrupted by acknowledging the most reasonable explanation. The defense counters with caution, urging jurors not to confuse probability with certainty, reminding them that doubt exists not as an inconvenience, but as a safeguard. The room holds its breath as the jury files out, the door closing with a sound that feels final and unfinished at the same time. Deliberations stretch longer than anyone predicted. Notes are requested. Testimony is replayed. Questions are asked about standards and definitions, about how to weigh absence against presence. Outside, the world continues, unaware of the careful arithmetic happening behind closed doors. The family waits, hands clasped, learning again that patience is a skill developed under duress. When the verdict comes, it arrives without flourish. Words are read. Reactions ripple quietly. Relief for some, disappointment for others, confusion for many. The outcome, whatever it is, fails to satisfy the hunger for clarity that has built over decades. A cold case does not transform into warmth simply because a decision has been made. It leaves behind residual chill, unanswered questions that do not vanish with a gavel strike. In the aftermath, appeals are discussed, sentences debated, legal pathways mapped. The suspect is led away or allowed to leave, depending on the decision, his future altered irrevocably regardless of the label attached. The family steps outside into sunlight that feels strangely inappropriate, reporters pressing for statements that will become quotes, trimmed and rearranged. They say what they can, what they have practiced saying for years, that they want the truth, that they want peace, that they will keep going. The community processes the outcome in fragments. Some feel justice has been served. Others feel a mistake has been made. Conversations flare and fade, opinions harden and soften, the case settling into a new phase of its long life. The alley remains, the diner still serves coffee, the memorial plaque catches the light. Places absorb history without comment. Investigators return to their desks with a mix of satisfaction and unease. They know they have done what they could with what they had, that the science worked as designed, that the system functioned within its limits. They also know that limits exist, that certainty is rare, that cold cases demand faith in processes that cannot promise perfection. They file reports, close loops, leave some questions marked unresolved. Time resumes its steady march, but the case lingers, referenced in training sessions and conferences, cited as an example of what DNA can do and what it cannot. It becomes part of a larger conversation about justice delayed and technology's reach into the past. For the family, it remains personal, a story that begins and ends with a woman who never came home. At night, when the city quiets, the alley listens, indifferent to verdicts and headlines. The fog still rolls in, streetlights still turn asphalt into gold, and somewhere in that familiar scene the truth exists, whole and unchanging, waiting for someone to see it clearly. The cold case, declared solved or not, continues to breathe, a reminder that some mysteries resist closure not because they are unsolvable, but because they belong to a space between what can be proven and what can be known. Years pass the way they always do after a verdict, quietly at first, then all at once, and the case settles into its afterlife, a phase no one prepares you for, where headlines fade but consequences remain sharp. Files are archived, evidence boxes resealed, and the word cold resurfaces in conversations that were once heated, now clinical. The city grows around the memory of what happened, new buildings rising where old fears once lingered, yet the night of 1995 refuses to be buried completely. It resurfaces in documentaries, in late-night radio segments, in the uneasy pauses that follow when someone asks if the truth was really found. The family lives in this space between acknowledgement and absence. They attend hearings that feel procedural and endless, appeals that reopen wounds without promising relief. Each motion filed is another reminder that justice is not a moment, but a series of negotiations with uncertainty. They learn legal language they never wanted to know, words like remand and evidentiary hearing, words that turn pain into paperwork. Friends drift away, unsure of what to say years later, while strangers reach out with theories and condolences that arrive too late and ask too much. The suspect, now defined by the case whether convicted or not, adapts to a new reality shaped by scrutiny. If incarcerated, he learns the rhythms of confinement, the way days blur and rumors travel faster than facts. If free, he moves through the world marked by suspicion, his name tied forever to a woman who vanished decades earlier. Either way, the past clings to him, an accusation that cannot be fully erased by legal outcomes. He maintains his version of events with consistency, repeating it until it becomes a shield, a mantra against the noise. Investigators watch from a distance, some retired, some promoted, all carrying fragments of the case with them. They recall the early days, the missteps, the moments when something small might have been noticed and wasn't. Hindsight sharpens regret into something that feels almost useful, though it rarely is. In lectures and seminars, the case is referenced as a lesson in patience, in the evolving power of DNA, in the dangers of tunnel vision. It becomes an example stripped of emotion, even as emotion was the fuel that kept it alive for so long. Technology continues its relentless advance, promising answers where none existed before. New methods emerge, capable of extracting meaning from samples once deemed hopeless. Each breakthrough sends a ripple of anticipation through cold case units everywhere, including this one. Analysts revisit the evidence again, running tests that were impossible a decade earlier, hoping for corroboration, for a detail that might illuminate the missing hours. The results are mixed, offering clarity in some areas and reinforcing ambiguity in others. Science, for all its progress, cannot reconstruct a night without witnesses or remains. Public interest flares periodically, reignited by anniversaries or media projects that frame the story anew. A podcast devotes an entire season to the case, its hosts speaking in hushed tones about mystery and justice, about the promise of DNA and the limits of certainty. Listeners binge episodes, form opinions, argue online about guilt and innocence, as if the outcome were a puzzle to be solved rather than a life fractured. The family listens to the episodes once, then stops, unwilling to hear their loved one's story filtered through speculation and ads. The community absorbs these retellings with a mixture of fascination and fatigue. Some residents remember the night clearly, others know it only as a reference point, a story told by parents who walked faster after dark. The alley is cleaner now, repaved, its edges softened by time and renovation. The diner has changed ownership, its walls repainted, its menu updated. Only the plaque remains, small and resolute, a refusal to let the memory disappear entirely. People touch it occasionally, a quiet acknowledgement before returning to their meals. The legal system moves on, but not without leaving scars. Appeals courts issue opinions dense with reasoning, parsing whether evidence was weighed appropriately, whether rights were upheld. Each decision is final and provisional at the same time, closing one door while leaving others ajar. The case becomes a citation, a paragraph in a larger argument about cold cases and the admissibility of genealogical DNA. It shapes policy in subtle ways, influencing how future investigations will proceed. For the family, the absence of physical remains remains the heaviest burden. Without a body, rituals feel incomplete, grief suspended. They imagine possibilities they wish they could reject, scenarios that intrude uninvited in quiet moments. They visit places she loved, speak her name aloud, refuse to let her be reduced to a case number or a cautionary tale. Their resilience is mistaken by some for closure, but closure is a myth they no longer chase. They aim instead for endurance. Occasionally, a new tip arrives, sparked by media exposure or a guilty conscience stirred by time. Investigators evaluate each one, methodical and weary, aware that most will lead nowhere. A man claims he heard a confession years ago. A woman insists she saw something she never reported. The leads are logged, assessed, and often dismissed, but the act of checking matters. It keeps the case alive in a way that is both hopeful and cruel. The suspect's narrative is scrutinized again and again, looking for cracks that might widen into truth. Statements are compared across decades, inconsistencies noted, explanations weighed. He remains steadfast, a constant in a story defined by change. Whether this consistency signals innocence or calculation is a question that divides opinion and fuels debate. It becomes easier for observers to choose a side than to sit with uncertainty. As time stretches on, the case influences how missing persons are handled in the region. Protocols change. Early evidence preservation becomes a priority. Families are offered more support, investigators trained to recognize patterns that once slipped through cracks. These improvements are small comforts, acknowledgments that lessons were learned even if they came too late to alter this outcome. Progress, like justice, is uneven. The woman at the center of it all remains both present and absent, her image fixed at 26, forever walking out of the diner into a night that refuses to explain itself. She exists in photographs, in memories, in the collective consciousness of a city that once assumed safety was a given. Her story reshaped how people move through the dark, how they think about strangers and routines, how they understand the fragility of ordinary evenings. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls in just as it did years ago, the case feels close again. Streetlights glow, footsteps echo, and the imagination fills gaps left by evidence. Somewhere between the certainty demanded by courts and the ambiguity endured by families lies a truth that may never be fully articulated. It is there in the silence, in the spaces between facts, in the unanswered questions that persist despite every effort to silence them. The cold case, whether labeled solved or unresolved, becomes a mirror reflecting the limits of human understanding. It shows how time can both conceal and reveal, how science can illuminate without absolving doubt, how stories continue long after the last page is turned. The city lives with that knowledge now, carrying it forward, a quiet companion to progress. And so the night of 1995 remains, not frozen but suspended, a moment stretched across decades, resisting closure. The alley stands. The diner hums. The plaque gleams softly. The questions linger, patient and unyielding, reminding anyone who listens that some truths do not arrive all at once, and some never arrive at all. Time has a way of rearranging priorities without asking permission, and as another decade edges forward, the case drifts into a strange middle ground, no longer breaking news yet never fully relegated to history. It exists in footnotes and memories, in training manuals and late-night conversations among detectives who wonder what they might have missed. The woman's name still surfaces in meetings, spoken with a kind of reverence reserved for cases that refuse to lie down quietly. Cold cases, they learn, have gravity. They pull at the present even when everyone insists on moving forward. The family marks anniversaries privately now. No press releases, no interviews, just candles and silence. They have learned that public attention can be a double-edged blade, sharp enough to cut through indifference, but just as capable of reopening wounds. They talk among themselves about how grief has changed shape over the years, how it no longer arrives as a tidal wave, but as an undercurrent that never truly recedes. They speak of her in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves and letting it happen. Language bends when the past feels unfinished. Investigators who once worked the case retire one by one, handing off institutional memory to younger colleagues who know the story only through files and recordings. Those recordings, digitized now, capture voices that crack under pressure, questions asked with urgency, long pauses heavy with meaning. The interrogation tapes are studied again, not because they promise new answers, but because they reveal patterns in denial and deflection. Experts debate tone and cadence, analyze micro-expressions frame by frame, searching for tells that may or may not exist. Interpretation becomes its own kind of evidence, persuasive to some, meaningless to others. The suspect's life continues under a shadow that refuses to lift. If imprisoned, he navigates a world where reputation is currency and the past is a weapon others wield freely. If outside, he exists on the margins, jobs short-lived, relationships strained by the weight of association. He files motions, gives interviews to journalists willing to entertain doubt, insists on his version of events with a calm that borders on rehearsed. His consistency becomes both shield and spectacle, a steady line in a story defined by fluctuation. Legal scholars cite the case when discussing the ethics of genealogical DNA, the balance between innovation and intrusion. Panels convene. Policies are drafted. Safeguards are strengthened. The woman's disappearance becomes a catalyst for change she will never see, her absence leveraged to protect future victims. It is a legacy that feels both meaningful and insufficient, a reminder that progress often feeds on tragedy. Public fascination ebbs and flows. A streaming documentary reignites debate, its reenactment slick and its narration ominous. Viewers binge-watch, forming opinions in living rooms far from California. Some praise the investigation's persistence, others question its conclusions, still others fixate on the mystery itself, detached from the human cost. The case becomes content again, consumed and discarded, its complexity flattened for dramatic effect. The family opts out, choosing peace over participation. The community absorbs these cycles with a weary familiarity. New residents learn the story secondhand, often surprised that such a thing could have happened in a place that feels so ordinary. Old-timers remember the fear, the way doors were locked earlier and glances lingered longer. The alley, now repurposed and lit by modern fixtures, bears no visible scars. Yet for those who know, it remains a landmark of absence, a place where something went wrong and time could not put it right. Occasionally, a breakthrough elsewhere sparks renewed hope. Another cold case is solved with newer technology, remains identified, questions answered at last. Investigators glance at this file again, wondering if one more advance might tip the balance. They consult labs, discuss possibilities, weigh costs against expectations. The evidence is finite, the options narrowing. Science can do much, but it cannot conjure what was never preserved. The family is notified of each development, however small. They listen politely, ask measured questions, thank the officers who call. They have learned not to attach too much emotion to updates that may lead nowhere. Hope, once raw and consuming, has been tempered into something durable but cautious. They hold it like a fragile object, careful not to drop it. The woman's story continues to shape how missing persons are discussed in the region. Early media engagement is more coordinated now. Families offered advocates to navigate attention without being overwhelmed. Investigators move faster to secure scenes, to preserve trace evidence, to consider possibilities beyond the obvious. These changes are often invisible to the public, but they ripple outward, quiet acknowledgments of lessons learned too late for one case, but in time for others. As years accumulate, memory becomes contested terrain. Witnesses age, some passing away, taking their recollections with them. Others become more certain of things they once doubted, confidence growing as details blur. The record captures these shifts, dates, and statements frozen even as minds evolve. Truth becomes layered, a palimpsest written and rewritten by time. The suspect's appeals exhaust available avenues, decisions rendered with language that emphasizes finality. The system signals its readiness to move on. Whether that readiness aligns with reality is another question. Justice, in this context, feels less like a destination and more like a boundary, a line drawn to contain uncertainty rather than eliminate it. The family confronts the idea of memorialization without resolution. They consider a foundation, scholarships, ways to honor her beyond the circumstances of her disappearance. They resist allowing her to be defined solely by what happened to her, insisting on celebrating who she was. In doing so, they reclaim a measure of control from a narrative that has long dictated their lives. The city changes in ways both subtle and profound. New technology alters how people navigate nights. Rideshares replace long walks, cameras multiply on corners once dark. Safety feels engineered now, monitored, quantified. Yet unease persists, a reminder that systems can fail and that vulnerability is never fully eliminated. The case remains a reference point, a caution whispered beneath the hum of progress. In quiet moments, detectives reflect on the nature of certainty. They talk about how some cases end with clarity and others with compromise, how evidence can be strong and still incomplete. They accept that not every story yields a satisfying conclusion, that their role is to pursue truth within constraints, not to guarantee comfort. This acceptance does not come easily. It is learned through years of unanswered questions. The woman at the center of it all remains unchanged by time, her image preserved at the age she was when the world lost track of her. She exists now in a kind of suspended animation, remembered through photographs and stories that refuse to age her. For the family, this stasis is both comfort and torment, a reminder of what was taken and what can never be returned. As another anniversary passes, the fog rolls in again, familiar and indifferent. Streetlights glow, footsteps echo, and somewhere between the present and the past the case continues to breathe. It does not demand attention the way it once did, but it persists, a low-frequency hum beneath daily life. The cold case remains, not as a frozen relic, but as a living question, shaping choices, influencing systems, and reminding anyone who listens that some nights never truly end. The passage of time changes the sound of a case, lowers its volume without muting it, and in that quieter register the truth becomes harder to separate from interpretation. Years after the last appeal is denied, after the final press conference folds into memory, the case lives on in margins. It is referenced in emails between agencies, in footnotes of academic papers, in the cautious tone detectives use when training new recruits. They talk about patience and restraint, about resisting the urge to declare victory when answers feel close but incomplete. They talk about this case. In a secured evidence room, temperature-controlled and windowless, the boxes remain. Labels yellow. Ink fades. Inside, the artifacts of a vanished night wait without expectation. The shoe. The scrap of denim. Photographs that captured angles and shadows long before anyone understood their significance. Every few years, someone opens the boxes again, not because policy demands it, but because curiosity and responsibility intersect. Each time, the contents look smaller than memory suggested. Each time, the silence inside feels heavier. Advances in analysis prompt another review. A lab technician suggests a new method for extracting trace material from porous surfaces. The proposal moves through committees, budgets are discussed, timelines mapped. The family is informed, cautiously. They nod, ask questions, remind themselves not to imagine outcomes. Samples are tested again. Results come back marginal, inconclusive, technically interesting, but legally inert. Another door opens a crack and then closes. The process leaves behind a familiar ache, the knowledge that possibility is not the same as resolution. The suspect's story remains unchanged, polished by repetition. In recorded statements, he speaks with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed every answer, who understands which details invite scrutiny and which deflect it. Analysts note the consistency, argue over its meaning. Some see deception honed by time. Others see the steadiness of a man wrongly accused. The debate never resolves, fueled by the same ambiguity that defines the case itself. Outside institutional walls, the story mutates. Online communities dissect timelines, overlay maps, propose theories that range from meticulous to fantastical. They debate DNA statistics, argue about transfer mechanisms, scrutinize body language and old footage. Each participant feels closer to the truth for having invested time and attention. Few consider the cost of perpetual speculation to those who live with the outcome. The case becomes a mirror for broader anxieties about trust, authority, and the limits of science. The family chooses distance. They focus on rituals that anchor them to the present, shared meals, anniversaries observed quietly, acts of kindness done in her name without announcement. They understand now that answers, if they come, may arrive without drama or not at all. Their grief has learned to coexist with uncertainty, a skill acquired unwillingly, but mastered through necessity. They still speak to investigators when asked, still authorize reviews, but they no longer rearrange their lives around the promise of closure. Within the department, a new generation takes over cold case responsibilities. They inherit files and philosophies, the understanding that persistence matters even when outcomes are unclear. They walk the alley again, note how the city has altered its contours, how the past is both visible and erased. They talk to residents who were children in 1995, now parents themselves, whose memories are shaped by stories rather than experience. The distance between then and now feels both vast and fragile. Policy shifts continue to ripple outward. Genealogical databases tighten consent protocols. Oversight committees refine guidelines. The case is cited as precedent, invoked when discussing proportionality and oversight. It becomes part of the architecture of reform, an example used to argue for balance rather than abandonment of powerful tools. In this way, the woman's disappearance influences outcomes she will never witness, shaping a future that acknowledges risk while pursuing accountability. Occasionally, A new witness surfaces, prompted by media or conscience. Their accounts are examined with care, contextualized against decades of record. Most add texture rather than clarity, reinforcing patterns already known. Investigators log them anyway, honoring the principle that no detail is too small to be considered, even when experience suggests where it will lead. The act of listening becomes its own form of respect. The city continues to evolve. Surveillance expands. Ride options multiply. People move differently at night now, guided by apps and alerts. The environment that once allowed someone to vanish has changed, but the memory of that vulnerability lingers. It shapes how safety is discussed, how resources are allocated, how quickly alarms are raised when someone does not arrive home. Progress is uneven, but it is not imaginary. In quiet offices, detectives debate the nature of truth. They talk about cases with bodies and confessions, about the comfort of certainty. They contrast those with this one, where evidence points and hesitates, where narratives overlap without aligning. They accept that justice systems are designed to manage doubt, not eliminate it. This acceptance does not diminish their commitment, it sharpens it, reminding them why rigor matters. The woman's image appears occasionally in training slides, not sensationalized, presented with care. Her story is told without embellishment, framed as a reminder that ordinary routines can end abruptly, that vigilance is not paranoia but preparedness. New officers listen, some moved, some analytical, all absorbing the lesson that time can be both ally and adversary. The suspect's presence recedes from headlines, replaced by newer stories. Yet his name remains indexed, searchable, a permanent association that neither verdict nor acquittal can fully dissolve. He lives with that reality, shaping his days around constraints imposed by public memory. He continues to assert his innocence, sometimes loudly, sometimes with resignation. Whether truth aligns with his assertion remains unresolved, suspended between records and belief. As another technological milestone is announced, a method promising deeper insight from degraded samples, the cycle begins again. Meetings are held. Expectations managed. Tests conducted. The outcome mirrors those before it, incremental knowledge without decisive impact. The pattern teaches restraint, a lesson absorbed slowly through repetition. Not every advance translates into answers. Not every case yields to persistence. The family receives the update with grace. They thank the investigators. They ask if this changes anything. It does not. They hang up and return to their lives, which have learned to accommodate the weight of not knowing. They have found meaning in endurance, in honoring her through presence rather than resolution. At night, the alley is quiet. The city hums beyond it, layered with sound and light. The place where something happened or did not exists without markers beyond memory. It asks nothing of passers-by. It offers no explanation. It simply is a reminder that absence can be as defining as presence. The cold case persists not because it demands attention, but because it resists erasure. It occupies a space between solved and unsolved, between science and story, between proof and belief. It teaches those who encounter it that certainty is rare and humility essential. It underscores the reality that some truths emerge slowly, and others remain partial no matter how long we look. As years continue their steady progression, the case remains what it has always been at its core: a woman who left work and never came home, a city that learned vulnerability, a system that tried and continues to try within its limits. The fog rolls in as it always has. Streetlights glow. Time moves forward. And the unanswered questions, patient and unyielding, move with it, shaping the present through the persistent echo of a night that refuses to fade. The passage of time changes the sound of a case, lowers its volume without muting it, and in that quieter register the truth becomes harder to separate from interpretation. Years after the last appeal is denied, after the final press conference folds into memory, the case lives on in margins. It is referenced in emails between agencies, in footnotes of academic papers, in the cautious tone detectives use when training new recruits. They talk about patience and restraint, about resisting the urge to declare victory when answers feel close but incomplete. They talk about this case. In a secured evidence room, temperature-controlled and windowless, the boxes remain. Labels yellow. Ink fades. Inside, the artifacts of a vanished night wait without expectation. The shoe. The scrap of denim. Photographs that captured angles and shadows long before anyone understood their significance. Every few years, someone opens the boxes again, not because policy demands it, but because curiosity and responsibility intersect. Each time, the contents look smaller than memory suggested. Each time, the silence inside feels heavier. Advances in analysis prompt another review. A lab technician suggests a new method for extracting trace material from porous surfaces. The proposal moves through committees, budgets are discussed, timelines mapped. The family is informed, cautiously. They nod, ask questions, remind themselves not to imagine outcomes. Samples are tested again. Results come back marginal, inconclusive, technically interesting, but legally inert. Another door opens a crack and then closes. The process leaves behind a familiar ache, the knowledge that possibility is not the same as resolution. The suspect's story remains unchanged, polished by repetition. In recorded statements, he speaks with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed every answer, who understands which details invite scrutiny and which deflect it. Analysts note the consistency, argue over its meaning. Some see deception honed by time. Others see the steadiness of a man wrongly accused. The debate never resolves, fueled by the same ambiguity that defines the case itself. Outside institutional walls, the story mutates. Online communities dissect timelines, overlay maps, propose theories that range from meticulous to fantastical. They debate DNA statistics, argue about transfer mechanisms, scrutinize body language and old footage. Each participant feels closer to the truth for having invested time and attention. Few consider the cost of perpetual speculation to those who live with the outcome. The case becomes a mirror for broader anxieties about trust, authority, and the limits of science. The family chooses distance. They focus on rituals that anchor them to the present, shared meals, anniversaries observed quietly, acts of kindness done in her name without announcement. They understand now that answers, if they come, may arrive without drama or not at all. Their grief has learned to coexist with uncertainty, a skill acquired unwillingly but mastered through necessity. They still speak to investigators when asked, still authorize reviews, but they no longer rearrange their lives around the promise of closure. Within the department, a new generation takes over cold case responsibilities. They inherit files and philosophies, the understanding that persistence matters even when outcomes are unclear. They walk the alley again, note how the city has altered its contours, how the past is both visible and erased. They talk to residents who were children in 1995, now parents themselves, whose memories are shaped by stories rather than experience. The distance between then and now feels both vast and fragile. Policy shifts continue to ripple outward. Genealogical databases tighten consent protocols. Oversight committees refine guidelines. The case is cited as precedent, invoked when discussing proportionality and oversight. It becomes part of the architecture of reform, an example used to argue for balance rather than abandonment of powerful tools. In this way, the woman's disappearance influences outcomes she will never witness, shaping a future that acknowledges risk while pursuing accountability. Occasionally, a new witness surfaces, prompted by media or conscience. Their accounts are examined with care, contextualized against decades of record. Most add texture rather than clarity, reinforcing patterns already known. Investigators log them anyway, honoring the principle that no detail is too small to be considered, even when experience suggests where it will lead. The act of listening becomes its own form of respect. The city continues to evolve. Surveillance expands. Ride options multiply. People move differently at night now, guided by apps and alerts. The environment that once allowed someone to vanish has changed, but the memory of that vulnerability lingers. It shapes how safety is discussed, how resources are allocated, how quickly alarms are raised when someone does not arrive home. Progress is uneven, but it is not imaginary. In quiet offices, detectives debate the nature of truth. They talk about cases with bodies and confessions, about the comfort of certainty. They contrast those with this one, where evidence points and hesitates, where narratives overlap without aligning. They accept that justice systems are designed to manage doubt, not eliminate it. This acceptance does not diminish their commitment, it sharpens it, reminding them why rigor matters. The woman's image appears occasionally in training slides, not sensationalized, presented with care. Her story is told without embellishment, framed as a reminder that ordinary routines can end abruptly, that vigilance is not paranoia but preparedness. New officers listen, some moved, some analytical, all absorbing the lesson that time can be both ally and adversary. The suspect's presence recedes from headlines, replaced by newer stories. Yet his name remains indexed, searchable, a permanent association that neither verdict nor acquittal can fully dissolve. He lives with that reality, shaping his days around constraints imposed by public memory. He continues to assert his innocence, sometimes loudly, sometimes with resignation. Whether truth aligns with his assertion remains unresolved, suspended between records and belief. As another technological milestone is announced, a method promising deeper insight from degraded samples, the cycle begins again. Meetings are held. Expectations managed. Tests conducted. The outcome mirrors those before it, incremental knowledge without decisive impact. The pattern teaches restraint, a lesson absorbed slowly through repetition. Not every advance translates into answers. Not every case yields to persistence. The family receives the update with grace. They thank the investigators. They ask if this changes anything. It does not. They hang up and return to their lives, which have learned to accommodate the weight of not knowing. They have found meaning in endurance, in honoring her through presence rather than resolution. At night, the alley is quiet. The city hums beyond it, layered with sound and light. The place where something happened or did not exists without markers beyond memory. It asks nothing of passers-by. It offers no explanation. It simply is a reminder that absence can be as defining as presence. The cold case persists not because it demands attention, but because it resists erasure. It occupies a space between solved and unsolved, between science and story, between proof and belief. It teaches those who encounter it that certainty is rare and humility essential. It underscores the reality that some truths emerge slowly, and others remain partial no matter how long we look. As years continue their steady progression, the case remains what it has always been at its core: a woman who left work and never came home, a city that learned vulnerability, a system that tried and continues to try within its limits. The fog rolls in as it always has. Streetlights glow. Time moves forward. And the unanswered questions, patient and unyielding, move with it, shaping the present through the persistent echo of a night that refuses to fade. The story does not end where records stop. It thins out instead, spreading into lives that continue to bend around an absence that never learned how to leave. By the time another generation comes of age, the case has become something people think they know, a headline they recognize, a cautionary tale distilled into a few familiar phrases. California. 1995. Cold case. DNA. Solved. Each word carries weight, but together they hide more than they reveal, smoothing a rough history into something that fits on a screen. Inside the department, the file is reopened not because of a new lead, but because of a question raised in a review meeting, a small procedural detail that refuses to settle. A supervisor asks whether a secondary transfer pathway was ever fully excluded, whether environmental factors could have altered the evidence more than initially assumed. The question does not accuse. It probes. And probing is enough to set the machinery in motion again. Memos circulate. Analysts revisit old reports. The past stirs restless under scrutiny. The lab runs simulations, recreates conditions as closely as possible. Concrete, Fabric time. They test how DNA behaves when exposed to moisture, to friction, to air. The results complicate the narrative without dismantling it. They suggest possibilities rather than conclusions, margins rather than certainties. Science, once again, refuses to be definitive. It offers context, not closure. The family is informed gently as always. They listen with practiced attention, aware that each update carries the potential to disrupt the equilibrium they have fought to maintain. They ask whether this changes the standing of the case. The answer is nuanced, careful. It depends. Depends has become a familiar word, one they have learned to live alongside hope and disappointment. When the call ends, they sit quietly, letting the information settle without letting it take over. The suspect's advocate seize on the ambiguity, filing motions that argue for reconsideration, for review in light of evolving standards. The language is precise, technical, stripped of emotion. It frames doubt as duty, uncertainty as obligation. The system responds slowly, methodically, weighing whether new interpretations warrant new action. Each step is deliberate, designed to prevent error even as it risks perpetuating it. Public attention flickers back on. Articles appear with cautious headlines, careful not to promise reversals yet eager to suggest possibility. Commentators debate what justice means when science changes midstream. Some argue that revisiting the case undermines confidence. Others insist that refusing to reconsider undermines it more. The discourse is loud, polarized, hungry for resolution that remains elusive. Within the community, reactions are muted. The case has taught them restraint. They have learned that certainty is fragile, that answers can shift with context. Conversations are quieter now, less reactive. People remember how quickly assumptions formed in the past, how hard they were to undo. Experience tempers enthusiasm. Investigators assigned to the review feel the weight of responsibility keenly. They understand that reopening questions risks reopening wounds. They also understand that ignoring doubt carries its own cost. They walk a careful line, committed to integrity over expedience. In interviews, they speak of process rather than outcome, of diligence rather than drama. It is not the language of headlines, but it is the language of work that matters. The alley is visited again, not for evidence, but for perspective. It has changed little in essence, though everything around it has shifted. New paint, new lighting, new traffic patterns. The space itself feels neutral, unremarkable, resistant to the significance imposed upon it. Standing there, investigators are reminded how easily meaning can be projected onto ordinary places, how extraordinary consequences can arise without warning. The family visits too, on a day without cameras. They stand where she might have stood, imagine what they cannot know. The exercise is painful but grounding. It connects them to a reality beyond speculation, a physical reminder of loss that no analysis can replace. They leave flowers briefly, then take them with them, unwilling to let the place become a shrine. Memory, for them, belongs elsewhere. As legal arguments unfold, the case becomes a focal point for broader discussions about finality. When should a verdict stand? How much uncertainty is acceptable? At what point does the pursuit of perfection risk injustice of another kind? These questions surface in op-eds and panels, debated by people far removed from the night that started it all. The abstraction feels necessary and hollow at the same time. The suspect speaks again, granting an interview that is calm, measured, almost weary. He talks about living under a question mark, about the impossibility of proving a negative decades later. He expresses sympathy for the family, insists that their pain is real even if their conclusions are not. His words are scrutinized, parsed for sincerity, weighed against a history that resists simplification. For some, his composure reads as innocence. For others, as calculation. The divide persists. Inside the department, the review concludes with recommendations rather than revelations. Clarifications. Caveats. A reaffirmation of procedures followed and acknowledgement of evolving understanding. The conclusions are unsatisfying in the way most honest assessments are. They do not overturn the past. They do not fully endorse it either. They exist in the space between, offering transparency without resolution. The announcement is made quietly, intentionally. There is no press conference, only a statement emphasizing commitment to accuracy and accountability. The reaction is mixed, as expected. Some feel reassured. Others feel frustrated. The family reads the statement together, recognizing its careful phrasing. They understand what it says and what it avoids. They feel neither vindicated nor betrayed, only tired. Time continues. The case recedes again, settling back into its familiar hum. The brief flare of attention fades, replaced by newer stories, fresher mysteries. Yet something has shifted subtly. The acknowledgement of complexity, of limits, lingers. It shapes how people talk about cold cases, how they frame expectations. It introduces humility into a space often dominated by certainty. For investigators, the experience reinforces a lesson learned repeatedly but never easily, that truth is not always accessible, that effort does not guarantee clarity. They return to their work with renewed caution, more attentive to nuance, less willing to declare endpoints prematurely. The case becomes a touchstone, invoked when debates arise about evidence and inference. The family adapts once more. They absorb the review into their understanding, adding another layer to a story already dense with complexity. They continue their lives, carrying her with them in ways that feel active rather than suspended. They volunteer, mentor, create meaning that does not depend on outcomes beyond their control. In doing so, they redefine what justice looks like for themselves. The city moves forward as cities do. Nights are busier now, illuminated by screens and schedules. People feel safer, though they know safety is conditional. The memory of vulnerability remains, encoded into policy and practice. The case is part of that encoding, an invisible influence on how decisions are made and resources allocated. And still, the night of 1995 persists, not as a frozen moment, but as a living question. It adapts to new contexts, absorbs new interpretations, refuses to resolve neatly. It reminds anyone who encounters it that stories do not always end, that some continue to evolve long after the last official word is spoken. The fog returns as it always has, indifferent to debates and reviews. Streetlights glow. Footsteps echo. Somewhere within that familiar scene lies a truth that may never be fully articulated, not because it is unknowable, but because knowing it would require a convergence of certainty the world rarely provides. The cold case remains, shaped by time, by effort, by doubt, and by the enduring human need to understand what happened when a woman walked out into the night and did not come back. The longer a case lives, the more it begins to resemble a shadow rather than a wound, stretching and reshaping itself, depending on the light cast upon it. By now, the night of 1995 is no longer anchored to a single generation. It belongs to those who were not yet born when the diner closed and the alley fell silent, who know the story only through retellings that mix fact with inference until the edges blur. For them, the cold case is not memory but mythology, a caution woven into the fabric of the city. Inside law enforcement, the case continues to influence how questions are asked. New detectives are trained to resist the seduction of narrative, warned that stories can form too early and harden into assumptions. In classrooms and conference rooms, instructors reference this investigation as an example of how momentum can mislead, how certainty must be earned repeatedly rather than assumed. The lesson is not that the case was wrong or right, but that it was human, shaped by context, technology, and pressure. The evidence room remains unchanged, its quiet broken only by the soft echo of footsteps when someone enters to retrieve a box. The artifacts inside have become almost ceremonial, handled with a reverence born of repetition. Gloves on. Forms signed. Photographs taken again, even though nothing has altered. The shoe still carries the suggestion of urgency. The denim scrap still whispers of contact without explaining it. These objects do not degrade further. They simply wait, indifferent to expectations placed upon them. Outside institutional spaces, the public continues to reinterpret the case through the lens of the moment. Social movements emphasizing accountability and transparency revisit old investigations, demanding answers and reassessments. Others push back, arguing that endless review erodes trust. The case becomes a rhetorical tool, invoked by opposing sides to support arguments that extend far beyond one woman's disappearance. Her story is stretched to fit agendas she never chose, her absence conscripted into debates that do not always honor its origin. The family navigates this terrain carefully, selective about engagement. They have learned that silence can be protective, that not every question deserves an answer. When they do speak, they emphasize complexity, resist absolutes, remind listeners that real lives do not conform to clean arcs. Their restraint frustrates some and earns respect from others. They no longer seek validation from strangers. They seek steadiness. Occasionally, a young journalist reaches out, earnest and determined, convinced there is a new angle that will finally illuminate the truth. The family listens, evaluates intentions, sometimes agrees, often declines. They have seen how easily nuance is lost once a story enters the churn. They protect what remains of their control, aware that the narrative will continue with or without their participation. Within forensic science, the case is cited in discussions about interpretive humility. Experts acknowledge that data does not speak for itself, that analysts bring frameworks and biases to their work. Conferences feature panels dissecting how conclusions are drawn, how language in reports can imply certainty beyond what evidence supports. The case serves as a reminder that precision in wording matters, that lives can hinge on how probabilities are communicated. The suspect's existence becomes quieter, less visible. Time erodes notoriety, replacing it with a dull persistence. He ages, marked by years that carry the weight of association whether deserved or not. His statements grow shorter, less defensive, as if repetition has worn away the need to persuade. He lives within the boundaries set by the case, boundaries that follow him regardless of outcome. His reality, like the family's, is defined by something unresolved. The city's geography continues to transform. New developments erase landmarks that once anchored memory. Streets are renamed. Businesses come and go. Yet the alley remains, stubborn in its anonymity. It is photographed occasionally by true crime tourists, its significance invisible to passersby who have no context for its quiet. The place does not advertise its role in the story. It simply exists, an ordinary corridor bearing an extraordinary burden. Law enforcement agencies elsewhere reach out, asking for insights, lessons learned. They want to know how to balance persistence with restraint, how to communicate uncertainty without appearing indecisive. Veterans of the case respond thoughtfully, emphasizing patience, documentation, and the courage to acknowledge limits. They stress that reopening questions should be driven by substance, not pressure. Their guidance carries the weight of experience earned through years of ambiguity. The family finds meaning in small acts. Scholarships funded quietly. Mentorship programs. Donations made without publicity. These gestures do not answer questions, but they assert presence, transform loss into impact. In doing so, they redefine legacy, shifting focus from what was taken to what can still be given. It is not closure, but it is movement. Public fascination wanes again, attention captured by newer mysteries and louder scandals. The case settles back into its long rhythm, punctuated by occasional reminders that it is still there. An anniversary passes with little notice. Another documentary proposal is declined. Life continues, as it must, even when understanding remains partial. In academic circles, the case is dissected as an example of epistemic uncertainty. Philosophers discuss what it means to know something within legal frameworks, how standards of proof intersect with human desire for narrative coherence. The discussion is abstract, detached from the alley and the diner, yet rooted in the same tension that has defined the case from the beginning. Knowing is not the same as believing. Proving is not the same as understanding. The family grows older. Milestones arrive without her, each one a quiet reminder of absence. They adapt, building lives that acknowledge loss without allowing it to consume everything else. They speak of her less often to outsiders, not because she is forgotten, but because she is woven into them in ways words cannot convey. Memory becomes internal, less performative. The department updates its cold case unit with new technology, new training, new perspectives. The case remains part of the archive, its lessons embedded in protocols and cautionary notes. It is no longer an active investigation in the traditional sense, but it is not dormant either. It exists as a reference point, a reminder that resolution is not guaranteed. As years continue to layer themselves over the past, the story resists simplification. Attempts to frame it as a triumph of science or a failure of justice fall short. It is neither. It is a complex intersection of effort, chance, limitation, and persistence. It defies the binary that headlines prefer. On certain nights, when the fog settles low and the city's noise softens, the case feels close again. Not because something new has happened, but because absence has a way of resurfacing in quiet moments. The streetlights glow, reflecting off pavement just as they did decades earlier. The environment repeats itself, indifferent to human timelines. The cold case endures not as a frozen mystery, but as a living question, adapting to each era that revisits it. It teaches patience without promising reward, inquiry without guaranteeing clarity. It asks those who encounter it to accept complexity, to sit with uncertainty, to resist the urge to force conclusions where evidence hesitates. And so the story continues, not forward toward an ending, but outward, influencing thought, policy, and memory in ways that cannot be neatly catalogued. The woman remains at its center, not as an emblem, but as a person whose absence reshaped a city's understanding of safety and certainty. Her night does not conclude. It echoes, softly but persistently, through the present, reminding anyone willing to listen that some truths are not delivered whole, and some are never delivered at all. The case reaches a point where chronology stops being useful, where years blur into a single, extended present defined less by dates than by persistence. By now, the story exists simultaneously in archives and in people, embedded in procedures and habits, resurfacing when least expected. It is invoked during audits and budget meetings, cited when someone asks why a particular protocol exists, why a step cannot be skipped. The answer is rarely spoken aloud, but it hangs there understood. Because of what happened. Because of what didn't. A new chief takes over the department, eager to leave a mark defined by modernization and transparency. In briefings, the cold case is mentioned cautiously, as both a testament to perseverance and a reminder of humility. The chief authorizes a comprehensive audit, not to relitigate outcomes, but to ensure that institutional memory remains intact. The audit team reviews logs, communications, evidence handling, decisions made under pressure. They find diligence and gaps, earnest effort and blind spots, the full spectrum of human work stretched over decades. The final report reads like a portrait rather than a verdict. The family is invited to review the findings before they are released. It is framed as respect, as inclusion. They accept, knowing the process will not deliver what the heart wants. They read carefully, recognize familiar language, notice where words soften hard edges. They appreciate the acknowledgement of impact, the admission of limits. They also recognize what remains unsaid. When they finish, they offer measured feedback, not demands. They have learned that influence does not always require confrontation. The release prompts a brief resurgence of attention. Commentators dissect the report's phrasing, argue over its implications. Some call it overdue honesty. Others call it institutional self-protection. The truth likely sits somewhere between. The report does not rewrite history, it reframes it, placing the case within a continuum of learning rather than resolution. It is unsatisfying in the way most accurate things are. In the forensic community, the case sparks renewed discussion about degradation curves and interpretive thresholds. A paper is published analyzing how environmental exposure might have affected the evidence, using this investigation as a hypothetical model. The conclusions are cautious, emphasizing variability and context. They do not exonerate or condemn. They complicate. The paper is cited, debated, and eventually folded into the larger body of work that shapes how future cases will be handled. The suspect's name appears less often now, overshadowed by newer cases and shifting priorities. When it does surface, it is usually in the context of policy rather than personhood. He becomes an example rather than a subject, his identity flattened into a line item. This reduction mirrors what happened to the woman at the center of the case for years, a symmetry that does not go unnoticed by those who care about such things. Life inside the family continues to evolve. Younger relatives grow up knowing the story as background noise, something always present but rarely discussed. They learn to navigate curiosity from peers, to answer questions without revealing too much. The family teaches them that they are not obligated to perform grief for anyone else's understanding. This lesson becomes a quiet inheritance, passed down alongside photographs and anecdotes. On certain anniversaries, the city holds small, unofficial gestures of remembrance. A candle placed quietly near the alley. A note taped briefly to the diner's back door before being removed. These acts are not organized or advertised. They happen because individuals remember, because memory finds expression even without permission. The city absorbs them without ceremony, allowing them to pass without comment. Within the department, the cold case unit adopts new metrics for success, moving away from closure as the sole outcome. They track preservation quality, interagency cooperation, family communication. The shift reflects an understanding shaped in part by this case, that doing the work well matters even when results are inconclusive. This reframing changes morale, allowing investigators to value rigor without tying worth to verdicts. A former detective, long retired, gives an interview reflecting on the case with the distance of age. He speaks candidly about mistakes and pressures, about how the tools of the time constrain choices. His tone is reflective rather than defensive. He acknowledges regret without assigning blame. The interview circulates briefly, praised for its honesty, then fades. It adds texture without altering the core uncertainty. The family watches the interview privately. They recognize the voice, remember meetings in cramped offices, the cadence of reassurance offered years ago. They feel a complicated mix of appreciation and sorrow. The past, once raw, now feels layered, its sharpest edges dulled by repetition. They are not healed, but they are seasoned, capable of holding complexity without breaking. The city's relationship with safety continues to evolve. New technologies promise predictive insights, algorithms designed to flag risk before harm occurs. These systems are rolled out with fanfare and skepticism. In planning sessions, someone inevitably raises the cold case as a reminder that unpredictability cannot be engineered away entirely. The reference is not accusatory. It is grounding. In classrooms, students studying criminal justice encounter the case as a case study stripped of names, reduced to variables and outcomes. They debate decisions, propose alternatives, test theories. For them, the story is intellectual, an exercise in reasoning. Some later learn the full context and feel the shift from abstraction to empathy. Others do not. Education, like justice, is uneven. The family continues its quiet work, supporting causes aligned with prevention and support. They do not frame these efforts as tribute, but as alignment with values shaped by loss. They have learned that meaning is constructed through action rather than explanation. This approach studies them when the world revisits the case with questions they can no longer answer. As the years accumulate, the case becomes less about what happened and more about what it reveals. It exposes the limits of memory, the evolution of science, the tension between certainty and fairness. It resists being claimed as a victory or a failure. It exists as a reminder that systems are composed of people, and people are constrained by context. One evening, a storm rolls through the city, heavy rain washing streets clean. The alley floods briefly, water pooling where the shoe once lay. By morning, the water has drained away, leaving no trace. The moment passes unnoticed by most, but for those who know, it feels symbolic without insisting on interpretation. The city moves on. In the evidence room, the boxes remain sealed. There are no plans to open them again unless a genuinely new method emerges. The decision is documented, justified, transparent. It marks a pause rather than an end. The difference matters. The cold case continues to shape conversations in subtle ways. When a new missing person report comes in, someone always mentions the importance of early action, of not assuming outcomes. The mention carries weight, Not because of fear, but because of memory. The case has taught the institution how to remember responsibly. The family marks another year without fanfare. They gather, share stories unrelated to the case, laugh, argue, live. Her absence is present, but it does not dominate every moment. This balance feels like progress, though it came at a cost no one would choose. As night falls, the city hums with activity. Lights glow. People move with purpose. The environment looks much as it did decades ago, even as everything else has changed. Somewhere within that continuity lies the enduring power of the case. It reminds the city that time does not erase questions, only changes how they are asked. The cold case remains, not demanding attention, not offering answers, simply existing as a testament to the complexity of truth. It has shaped policies, influenced lives, and altered how absence is understood. It does not conclude. It persists, woven into the fabric of the city, a quiet echo of a night that never fully released its hold. And in that persistence lies its final lesson, that understanding is not always achieved through resolution, that sometimes the most honest outcome is to acknowledge what cannot be fully known, and to carry that knowledge forward with care. By the time a decade has passed since the last meaningful procedural update, the case stops behaving like an investigation and starts acting like weather, something you live under rather than confront directly. It influences decisions quietly, changes how people move, how they speak, how long they pause before making claims. In meetings, when someone proposes certainty too quickly, there is a look exchanged across the table, a subtle reminder that certainty has a cost. No one needs to name the case anymore. It is understood. The city's archive expands, digitized and indexed, a monument to preservation. The cold case occupies a corner of this system, its documents scanned with clinical precision. Marginal notes become metadata. Handwritten timelines flatten into searchable fields. The act is practical, almost sterile, yet the effect is intimate. To see the past rendered so cleanly feels like an intrusion to some, a necessary evolution to others. The archive does not judge. It holds. A graduate student stumbles upon the files while researching investigative inertia. The language captivates them, the cautious phrasing, the hesitations embedded in official prose. They notice how often words like appears, suggests, and cannot be ruled out recur. The student writes a thesis about epistemic restraint, about how institutions encode doubt. The case becomes an exemplar, not because it failed, but because it resisted simplification. The thesis is defended, praised, shelved. Its arguments seep quietly into future classrooms. Within the department, a younger generation takes leadership roles. They inherit policies shaped by the long shadow of the case, sometimes without knowing the origin. They accept protocols as given, rarely questioning why certain redundancies exist. When asked, veterans explain with stories, fragments rather than full accounts. The narrative is passed down in pieces, enough to inform behavior without overwhelming. This is how institutional memory survives. The family receives fewer calls now. Media cycles have moved on, their attention redirected to fresher mysteries. When a request does arrive, it feels almost quaint, a reminder that the world still remembers. The family weighs each inquiry against their current capacity, choosing peace more often than participation. They have learned that engagement is not an obligation. Silence, too, can be an answer. On the anniversary of the night, the city does not pause. Traffic flows. Shops open. Life continues. But in a small circle, candles are lit at home, names spoken softly, rituals observed without audience. These moments are not about public recognition. They're about continuity, about marking time in a way that acknowledges loss without surrendering to it. The family has learned to create their own calendars. In law schools, professors discuss standards of proof, using anonymized versions of the case to illustrate the gap between suspicion and certainty. Students debate hypotheticals, argue passionately, unaware of how close their abstractions brush against real lives. Some leave class unsettled, recognizing for the first time that justice is not synonymous with resolution. Others remain convinced that answers exist somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. Both reactions are part of the legacy. The suspect's story fades further into obscurity. He is no longer a focal point, more a footnote in discussions about process. This erasure is not vindication or condemnation. It is exhaustion. The public's appetite for ambiguity has limits. Without new developments, attention drifts. His life continues in parallel to the case, shaped by it yet not consumed by it, a reminder that unresolved stories persist beyond headlines. The alley is repaved. The cracks filled, the surface smoothed. For most, it is an improvement, a small civic upgrade. For a few, it feels like an erasure, a subtle rewriting of geography. They take photographs, archive images, preserve what memory they can. The city does not notice the significance. Infrastructure does not pause for symbolism. At a conference on cold case methodologies, a panelist references the investigation obliquely, discussing the ethics of reopening wounds. They argue that persistence must be balanced with compassion, that families are not resources to be mined for content. The audience nods, some in agreement, some in recognition. The case has influenced the discourse without dominating it, shaping values rather than outcomes. The family's youngest members come of age. They inherit stories secondhand, learn to carry them lightly. They understand that the case is part of their history, not their identity. This distinction matters. It allows them to step forward without dragging the weight of expectation. They honor the past by living fully, not by remaining fixed within it. Technology advances again. New forensic techniques promise deeper insights, finer resolution. Proposals surface suggesting a reevaluation of preserved evidence. Committees convene, feasibility assessed. The conclusion is cautious. Potential exists, but margins are slim. The decision is made to wait, to preserve rather than risk. It is a choice informed by decades of restraint. Not all doors must be opened immediately. The cold case unit updates its training materials, incorporating lessons distilled from years of reflection. They emphasize communication with families, transparency about limits, documentation of uncertainty. Recruits listen, some impatient, some thoughtful. They will not truly understand until they encounter their own unsolved case, when theory meets reality and patience is tested. A novelist becomes interested in the story, drawn to its ambiguity. They research quietly, avoid direct interviews, piece together a fictionalized account inspired by themes rather than facts. The resulting book is praised for its restraint, its refusal to provide answers. Readers debate its meaning, project their own conclusions. The family reads it privately, recognizing echoes without feeling exposed. Fiction offers distance where journalism once felt invasive. In the city council chambers, funding debates reference the cold case indirectly as justification for sustained investment in investigative infrastructure. The argument is pragmatic: better tools, better training, fewer regrets. The case serves as a cautionary tale without being exploited. Its influence is woven into policy rather than spectacle. The family's grief changes texture. It is no longer sharp, but it remains present, a low hum beneath daily life. They speak of her in the present tense sometimes, not out of denial, but habit. Memory refuses to be neatly categorized as past. It intrudes gently, unexpectedly, a reminder of connection rather than absence. The archive continues to grow, absorbing new cases, new stories. The cold case remains accessible, its files pristine, its questions intact. It does not demand attention, but it offers lessons to those who seek them. It is a mirror reflecting the values of each era that revisits it. As night falls again, the city's lights blur in the distance. Somewhere, a detective reviews a new file, pauses before making assumptions, influenced by a case they may only know in outline. Somewhere else, a family gathers, sharing a meal, carrying history quietly. These parallel moments intersect invisibly, bound by a story that refuses to conclude. The cold case endures not as an open wound, but as a scar, evidence of healing without forgetting. It has reshaped practices, tempered certainty, taught patience. It exists as a reminder that some truths resist capture, that justice is a process rather than a destination. And so the city moves forward, informed by what it cannot fully explain. The case remains not frozen in time, but integrated into the present, a silent advisor guiding choices, urging care. It does not promise answers. It offers perspective. And in that offering, it continues to matter.